In this module, we'll talk about the mechanics of creating scales for your questionnaire. You'll learn how to use all the theory we talked about to construct scales that make sense for you. In order to create a scale for your questionnaire, you have to make a series of decisions. Should this be a single item scale or a multiple item scale? That is, should you ask about one aspect or more than one aspect? If the construct being measured is simple, a single item scale, that is, asking about a single aspect, may be sufficient. But if you're measuring something complex, like perceptions or attitude, a multiple item scale such as a Likert scale or semantic differential scale is necessary. How many scale points should the scale have? The more points you have, the better your ability to differentiate between different shades of opinion. Unless you have a simple yes-no type of question, usually you need a minimum of 3 scale points and you can go up to 11 scale points. The recommended number is 5 to 7 scale points. Should you have an odd or even number of scale points? For example, should you have a 4-point scale or a 5-point scale? The advantage of an odd number of scale points is that the scale has a midpoint, which allows the respondent to express a middle position in between the two extremes. With an even number of scale points, there is no midpoint, so the respondent must choose one side or another. For this reason, scales with an even number of points are called forced choice scales. They are usually not a good idea because respondents should be allowed to have a middle position. However, sometimes an even number of points is better. For example, when you want to know which way the respondent is inclined and a middle position is not helpful to you, you can use a forced choice scale. In measuring purchase intentions, we often use a 4-point scale that goes from definitely would buy to definitely would not buy, so that we get an idea of which way the respondent is inclined. By the way, if you are measuring purchase intentions, remember that people tend to overstate their intention, so you need to discount the answers, that is, assume people are less positive than they claim and are less likely to buy the product than they claim. Should response categories be labeled? That is, should you have a label such as somewhat important or extremely important attached to the different answers? At a minimum, we have to label the endpoints of the scale, for example, not at all important and extremely important. However, there are pros and cons to labeling the categories in between. On the plus side, if you label each option, you can interpret the response more easily. For example, if someone checks the box for somewhat important, you know their response means exactly that. So when you communicate the results to others, you can say things like 50% of the sample said this was somewhat important. If you had not labeled that option but left it as a number on the scale, the interpretation is less clear. If someone circles the number 2 on the scale where 1 is not at all important and 5 is extremely important, what exactly does that mean? It's hard to put into words when you're making a presentation. On the other hand, unless you can be sure that your labels are good ones and are equally distant from each other on the scale, you may not have an interval scale at all. That is, suppose you are measuring importance and you label the 3 middle points on the scale as somewhat important, important, and fairly important. You cannot be sure that in the respondent's mind, the difference between the first 2 labels, somewhat important and important, is the same as the difference between the second and the third labels, important and fairly important. In other words, the distance between consecutive points on the scale may not be the same, which would mean that it is not an interval scale, and you should not try to calculate a mean value on that scale. The bottom line is that if understanding the precise meaning of each response is important, use labels for all the categories. But avoid doing that if you want to calculate the mean and run other statistical tests on the data. Well, that's it. You are now equipped to construct scales for your questionnaires.